Most people do not understand what has happened to the American middle class because they are looking at the wrong number. They keep staring at income. I look at the gate. I have spent my life studying systems that decide who gets stronger and who gets squeezed. In business, that usually comes down to pricing power, incentives, and hidden friction. In ordinary life, it now comes down to something far uglier. Before an American family can save, invest, breathe, or make a rational long-term decision, it has to pass through a growing line of tollgates just to function. That is the part almost nobody says plainly. You can earn what sounds like a respectable household income. You can do everything the culture told you to do. Work full-time, pay your taxes, try to raise children, try to keep a car running, try not to miss a premium, try not to get sick at the wrong time. And after all of that, you discover that your problem is not extravagance. Your problem is that modern life has been turned into a gated system. Every gate wants cash, every gate arrives before freedom, and every gate is getting more expensive. So when you hear that, the median American household earns about $83,000 a year. You are supposed to picture stability, a decent home, a reliable car, maybe one family trip, maybe room to save, maybe the old middle-class bargain still works if you are disciplined enough. That picture is dead, and what replaces it is more dangerous than open poverty, because it comes wrapped in the costume of normalcy. You look normal, you sound normal. Your tax return looks normal, but your life is balanced on one repair bill, one rent increase, one premium hike, one child care invoice, one dental emergency. That is not prosperity. That is a family standing upright while water rises around its ankles. The reason this matters so much is simple. Once a society prices normal participation above the level of ordinary security, people do not merely feel stressed. They become strategically weak. Weak people make expensive decisions. Weak people take bad debt because they need speed. Weak people stop thinking in years and start thinking in Fridays. Weak people do not negotiate from strength. They do not move cities for opportunity. They do not leave bad jobs. They do not start businesses. They do not invest with patience. They do not marry risk with judgment. They buy temporary relief because temporary relief is all the system has left them. That is how a middle class turns into a population of compliant renters in every sense of the word. If I wanted to explain the modern American squeeze in one sentence, I would say it this way. You are not paying for luxuries first and then wondering why wealth never forms. You are paying admission first. Wealth never gets a turn. Look at the arithmetic honestly. A household can earn roughly $83,000 a year and still bring home something in the middle 60s after federal taxes, payroll taxes, and often state taxes. People hear 83. Life is lived on the amount that remains. The machine does not care about your gross number. The machine only cares about what makes it through the gate. Now start paying the tolls. Housing goes first because housing always goes first. In many major markets, that means something in the high 20s or more, even before you feel remotely comfortable. Transportation goes next because America built work around wheels, not around proximity, insurance, gas, maintenance, registration, maybe financing. There goes another large slice, then healthcare. Families contribute thousands before they've used anything. Then child care, which in many places is not a side expense but a second mortgage in disguise by the time you finish paying the participation tolls. The so-called median household does not feel rich because it is not rich. It is not even flexible. It is cornered. And this is the first brutal truth most people avoid. A great deal of modern household spending is not consumption. It is permission. The car is permission to reach the job. The child care is permission for both adults to keep earning. The health premium is permission to avoid one illness turning into a financial crater. The rent or mortgage is permission to remain inside the geography where opportunity supposedly exists. That changes the whole moral picture. Once you understand that, you stop saying foolish things like people just need better budgeting. Budgeting matters. I love discipline, but there is a difference between waste and tolls. Waste is when you buy status you cannot afford. Tolls are when the road has been privatized and you must pay just to move. A lot of public debate in America is still trapped in an older moral script. Work hard, earn more, be responsible. If you are still under pressure, maybe you are spending badly. That was always too simple. Now it is completely dishonest because the benchmark the country still uses to decide who is officially in trouble was built for a different world. Back in the early 1960s, the official poverty threshold was built using a crude, but at the time not irrational shortcut. Families spent about a third of their budgets on food, so policymakers took the cost of a bare-bones food plan and multiplied it by 3. Food times 3 became the line. Not comfort, not mobility, not resilience. just a rough estimate of how little was too little. In that era, the shortcut had some relationship to reality. Housing did not yet dominate the family budget the way it does now. Employer health coverage had not mutated into the premium monster we know today. Child care was not a giant market cost for nearly every two-income household. College could still be attacked with summer wages and sanity. That world is gone, but the benchmark lingers like a ghost with government authority. Today, food is a much smaller share of household spending than it was when that formula was created. Housing has swollen. Healthcare has swollen. Childcare has swollen. Insurance has swollen. The fixed costs of participation have swollen. Yet the line that determines who is officially poor still carries the DNA of a budget structure that no longer exists. That is not a technical glitch. That is a policy hallucination. And hallucinations are dangerous when they are wired into benefits, tax credits, Medicaid, housing support, food assistance, and public conversation. Because once the benchmark lags reality badly enough, you create a large class of people who are statistically fine and economically breakable. I want you to understand the strategic significance of that phrase. Statistically fine, economically breakable. That is the new American middle. You can earn too much to qualify for meaningful help and too little to buy stability at market prices. You exist in the dead zone between the government S story and the cash register S story. One says you are standing, the other says you are one invoice away from kneeling. When I buy a business, I care deeply about hidden liabilities. Most people look at the reported earnings. I look at what those earnings owe to reality. How much maintenance is being deferred? How much working capital is being quietly consumed? How much price sensitivity the customer can tolerate? In the same way, I do not look at a household S income and ask what it earned. I ask what it must feed before it can keep a dollar. That is how you see the truth. And the truth is that the modern household is carrying a liability structure that the old poverty line never had to see. This is why the argument over poverty in America is often so sterile. One side points to official thresholds and says the country is richer than complainers admit. The other side points to lived experience and says the numbers are absurd. Both are seeing part of the picture. But the deeper answer is this. The structure of household costs changed faster than the language used to measure hardship. When that happens, the culture starts gaslighting itself. People feel fragile, then feel guilty for feeling fragile. They earn more than the line says they should need, so they assume the weakness must be personal. That is where psychological damage begins. A bad system becomes an inner accusation. You start blaming yourself for not feeling safe at an income level. That sounds respectable in conversation. You feel behind. You compare yourself to a benchmark that carries almost no relationship to the actual cost of maintaining a family inside the modern economy. Then you make things worse trying to look fine. You lease appearances, you finance convenience, you stay in the expensive zone because leaving, it feels like social descent. You stop building reserves because every month already feels like a small emergency. That is how the gate wins twice. First it takes your cash, then it takes your clarity. And without clarity, your capital allocation deteriorates. You stop acting like an owner. You become a manager of recurring damage. This is why I have always said that money is not only about what it buys, it is about what it lets you refuse. A rational life requires refusal power. The power to refuse a bad boss, refuse a predatory loan, refuse a neighborhood that is collapsing your finances, refuse a medical shock, becoming a debt spiral, refuse a sales pitch built on your exhaustion. When all your money is consumed by participation tolls, refusal power disappears. And once refusal power disappears, your labor becomes cheaper than your RFA-SUMFA suggests. This is not just about households at the bottom. It reaches far into the people who still think of themselves as secure. A six-figure income in a high-cost city can look impressive and still function like a high-speed conveyor belt carrying cash away from the future. After taxes, housing, transportation, healthcare, childcare, and the thousand small charges of modern adult life, what remains may be stability without slack, comfortable enough to appear successful, not strong enough to absorb a major hit. That is one of the great deceptions of modern affluence. Many households have moved up in nominal income without escaping fragility. The label improved, the structure did not. You can see how distorted the system has become by examining what happens when people begin to climb. In a healthy system, earning more should produce more safety. In a sick system, earning more can trigger punishment. America has built one of the quietest punishment systems I have ever seen, and it hides behind good intentions. We call it the benefits cliff. Here is the brutal version. A lower-income household receives help with food, childcare, or health care. Then income rises modestly on paper. That sounds like progress in real life. Crossing the wrong threshold can vaporize benefits worth far more than the raise. Gross pay rises, net stability falls. A 50-cent raise can erase thousands in support. A better hourly wage can leave a family more exposed than before. Imagine what that does to behavior. You teach people that movement is dangerous. You turn advancement into a trapdoor. You make every extra dollar suspect. That is not welfare. That is bad engineering. And when bad engineering combines with rising participation costs, you produce a society where millions live in the gap between help and self-sufficiency, too high for aid, too low for ease. Invisible to official poverty counts, obvious to every monthly bank statement. This is one reason I get nervous whenever a culture becomes obsessed with headline income and careless about cost structure. In investing, people love gross returns and ignore the drag fees, taxes, inflation, leverage, costs, behavioral mistakes. Those drags determine destiny. Household economics works the same way. If your fixed cost drag rises faster than your income, you can feel poorer at a higher salary. That is not emotional weakness. That is math. The pandemic accidentally exposed this truth in a way years of policy debate could not. For a brief period, many of the participation tolls dropped. Commuting collapsed. Childcare routines changed. Dry cleaning, work lunches, gas. The daily cash bleed of simply showing up to the economy. Much of it paused. Savings spiked. Of course, stimulus played a role. But so did the simple fact that when the Tollgates stopped charging for a while, even stretched households can suddenly breathe. That was a flashing red signal. It showed that many families were not drowning because they lacked discipline. They were drowning because the baseline admission fee to ordinary life had become absurd. Then the gates reopened, and many of them reopened at a higher price. Mortgage rates rose. Insurance rose. Healthcare premiums rose. Home prices remained swollen. Childcare remained punishing. The pressure resumed, which told you something even more important. This is not a temporary mood problem. It is structural. Structural problems require structural thinking. And that is where most people make another mistake. They take a structural problem and answer it only with emotional remedies, cut lattes, be positive, visualize abundance, manifest calm. I have no interest in that nonsense. When a bridge is overloaded, I do not tell the steel beams to journal. I reduce load, redesign flow, and strengthen the supports. You should treat your household the same way. First, stop using the official story as your personal reality. If a benchmark built for a food, heavy 1960s budget says you are fine, and your actual cash flow says you are fragile, trust the cash flow. Numbers are useful only if they still map the territory. If they do not, they become camouflage. Second, separate participation costs from ego costs. This is one of the most important filters you can install. Some expenses are tolls imposed by the environment. Others are self-imposed tribute to status. The first category deserves respect and careful engineering. The second deserves a knife. If you confuse them, you either cut necessities and suffer or protect vanity and call it unavoidable. Both are expensive forms of self-deception. Third, build what I call anti-gate capital. Anti-gate capital is any reserve, system, skill, or asset that reduces how often the toll gates can threaten your life. Cash reserves are anti-gate capital because they stop a repair bill from becoming debt. A paid-off modest car is anti-gate capital because it reduces the recurring toll of transportation. Living beneath the prestige line is anti-gate capital because it lowers the housing gate. Skills that let you earn remotely or flexibly are anti-gate capital because they loosen geography's grip on you. Family and community arrangements that lower childcare dependence are anti-gate capital. Good health habits are anti-gate capital because they reduce how often the healthcare gate gets to swing at you. A side income built on ownership rather than extra hours is anti-gate capital because it interrupts total dependence on one employer and one payroll cycle. You do not beat a gated economy with optimism. You beat it by building enough anti-gate capital that each toll booth loses some leverage over your decisions. Fourth, stop confusing stability with wealth. Stability means the gates can be paid this month. Wealth means the gates do not control your future. Those are radically different conditions. Many households with decent incomes have purchased stability while remaining almost entirely gate-owned. Every large decision still depends on continued permission from employers, insurers, lenders, landlords, school districts, and interest rates. That is not ownership. That is managed vulnerability. Fifth, think in fixed cost ratios, not just income goals. A raise helps, of course it helps. But if every raise is immediately converted into higher recurring obligations, then income growth only feeds the gates. A household that earns less but keeps its fixed cost burden lower may be strategically stronger than a household that earns more and is locked into a larger daily toll. This is where the worker versus owner divide becomes painfully clear. The worker mindset asks, how do I earn enough to keep paying the gates? The owner mindset asks, how do I reduce the number and power of gates between my income and my future? That is a completely different game, and it leads to a completely different kind of dignity. A lot of Americans feel shame because they cannot convert what sounds like a respectable income into peace. I would rather they convert that shame into clearer judgment. You are not crazy for noticing the system has moved. It has. The old formulas measure a floor. They do not describe a stable life. They do not capture the cost of participation. They do not tell you how much pressure a family can carry before one surprise becomes a crisis. There is another layer here that people miss because they do not think like capital allocators. When fixed costs dominate a life, time gets colonized. You begin to schedule your choices around invoice dates. You do not choose the best school, city employer, or business opportunity on the basis of long-term return. You choose the option least likely to interrupt the next series of mandatory payments. That is a profound loss of economic freedom. You can see it in housing decisions. Families do not ask, where will we build the strongest balance sheet over 10 years? They ask, what can we survive this month without losing face? You can see it in work. People do not ask, what role compounds skill, reputation, and ownership? They ask which employer keeps health insurance in place with the least immediate risk. You can see it in child decisions. Couples do not ask, what kind of family life do we want to build? They ask, can we survive the child care gate without detonating the rest of the budget? The gate changes not only what you can buy, it changes what you dare to imagine. That is why this issue is so corrosive. It does not merely drain money. It shrinks ambition into self-preservation. In my world, a company that cannot survive a mild disruption is not called efficient. It is called fragile. But millions of households are praised as responsible even while operating with no margin for error. They have the right job title, the right zip code, the right school district, the right RFA, SUM-FE language. What they do not have is resilience. Their entire stability depends on continuous cooperation from every major gate in the system. The boss must remain satisfied, the landlord must remain moderate, the insurer must remain affordable, the transmission must remain intact, the child must remain healthy, the mortgage rate must not reset too far, the premium must not jump too high, the day care bill must not outrun the raise. That is not stability. That is synchronized dependence. And synchronized dependence is dangerous because shocks rarely arrive one at a time. A child gets sick while the car needs work. Insurance rises while rent renews higher. One spouse loses hours while groceries climb. The gates do not line up politely. They rush together. That is when a household discovers whether it had a middle-class income or merely a middle-class costume. Another mistake people make is assuming that because America is richer in aggregate, the ordinary household must be safer in practice. Aggregate wealth can rise while household optionality falls. Stock markets can rise while young families are forced to delay children. National income can rise while housing becomes an asset class instead of a shelter. Policy can declare success while the participation toll keeps expanding. This is why I care less about averages than structures. Average numbers can flatter a broken system. Structure reveals where the pressure lives, and the pressure today lives in the fixed cost gates. Housing is the giant gate, healthcare is the stealth gate, transportation is the recurring gate, childcare is the ambition tax, insurance is the volatility gate, and debt, when used to bridge these gates, becomes the compound gate, because now the cost of participation itself begins charging interest. Once that happens, fragility accelerates. That is why so many families feel as if they are running hard without gaining ground. They are the gates reprice faster than their surplus can form. Now let me say something that may sound cruel but is actually liberating. A large share of what Americans call middle-class aspiration is now financially obsolete. I do not say that to insult people. I say it because clinging to an obsolete script is one of the most expensive habits on earth. The old script assumed one income could cover a household. It assumed home prices would not detach from wages this violently. It assumed health care would not become a second tax. It assumed transportation would remain manageable. It assumed child care would not rival tuition. It assumed the official benchmark would roughly track life. Those assumptions have expired, but millions of people still organize their self-worth around an old model and then blame themselves for not making it work. That is madness. You do not solve a changed system by worshiping its dead blueprint. You solve it by seeing the new gates clearly and designing around them without sentimentality. That may mean living in a less flattering zip code while buying back margin. That may mean driving a machine for reliability rather than image. That may mean keeping housing low enough that one job loss does not become a family-level emergency. That may mean building skills that travel better than your current employer. That may mean rejecting consumer theater so that cash can become capital. That may mean choosing a smaller life on the outside so you can own a larger life on the inside. People hear that and think sacrifice. I hear strategy because every dollar not fed to the gate can be promoted into a different rank. It can become reserve capital. It can become debt resistance. It can become investing capital. It can become relocation capital. It can become refusal power. It can become time, and time, once protected, begins to repair judgment. This is the system shift most people need. Stop treating savings as leftover virtue. Treat it as gate-breaking capital. Stop treating slack as laziness. Treat it as strategic oxygen. Stop treating optionality as a luxury for the rich. Treat it as the first sign that you are becoming difficult for the gates to control. That is also why I reject the cheap status competition that dominates so much modern life. Status spending inside a gated economy is self-sabotage. If the participation toll is already high, then voluntary prestige tolls are poison. The household that learns to separate dignity from display is already halfway out of the trap. I call this the inner ledger. The outer ledger is what the world sees. Salary, neighborhood, school, car, title. The inner ledger is what actually matters. Reserves, fixed, cost burden, optionality, debt load, mental bandwidth, time to think, ownership accumulation. Most people live by the outer ledger and wonder why they feel poor at incomes their parents would have considered rich. The answer is that the outer ledger impresses neighbors. The inner ledger protects lives, and if you do not choose the inner ledger deliberately, the gate will choose the outer ledger for you. It will sell you the right look, the right district, the right conveniences, the right story, then leave you with no room to breathe when the bill arrives. The ultimate consequence of all this is not just personal stress. It is economic passivity, a population that cannot afford interruption, cannot take risks. A population that cannot take risks cannot create much. It postpones children, businesses, moves, experiments, education shifts, and career pivots. It preserves payroll and calls that prudence. Sometimes it is prudence. Often it is a hostage negotiation with fixed costs. I am not pretending individual design solves every national problem. It does not. But individual clarity is still a weapon. You may not control the official poverty line. You may not control housing policy. You may not control health insurance pricing. You may not control child care markets. What you can control is whether your life keeps pretending the old map still works. That is the real escape path. Name the gate, measure the gates, strip away vanity gates. Lower the fixed cost gates where you can accumulate anti-gate capital relentlessly, convert income into refusal power before converting it into appearances. Build reserve months, not just monthly habits. Favor ownership over endless participation fees. Protect relationships and community, because isolation makes every gate more expensive. And stop calling yourself secure until your structure proves it. That last rule matters, because false confidence is how families wander into traps they had no balance sheet to survive. So here is the personal test. If your income stopped tomorrow, how many months would your judgment stay calm? Not your lifestyle, your judgment. How long before the gates would push you into fear? Fear into haste, haste into debt, debt into surrender. That is the only test I trust now, because the line between stability and fragility is no longer explained by a government threshold built from food budgets half a century ago. It is explained by how much of your life belongs to Tollgates and how much belongs to you. You can keep living by a dead benchmark and call your anxiety irrational. You can keep treating every recurring charge as normal because everyone around you is also normalizing it. You can keep feeding a design where your labor arrives and vanishes before it ever has the chance to become capital. You can keep decorating the outside while the inside remains one surprise away from panic, or you can do something rarer. You can admit that the gate is real. You can admit that the old middle-class script has been repriced. You can admit that being above the official line does not mean being above danger. You can stop worshiping gross income and start respecting net survivability. You can become less visually successful and more structurally free. You can choose a life where fewer dollars are required to remain upright and more dollars survive long enough to fight for your future. That is not retreat. That is the beginning of ownership. Because if your household still belongs to every gate that stands between your paycheck and your peace, then you are not yet building wealth. You are financing admission. And the older you get before you tell yourself that truth, the more years you will spend mistaking endurance for freedom. I would not make that mistake with a business. I would not make it with a stock. And if I were you, I would stop making it with your life.